name is Elizabeth Andersen, and I am the director of the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. And I'm delighted to welcome you here to this panel on what I think is a really pressing, what Danny's organization has called a crisis topic for the rule of law, that is the shrinking space for civil society. And this is a critically important topic for us here at the World Justice Forum for a number of reasons. First, it is a rule of law crisis, what we are seeing. I've characterized it as a pandemic of restrictions on the space for civil society to operate around the world. It is itself a symptom of rule of law degradation. It is also a real challenge to those of us in civil society who are working to advance the rule of law. So we heard this morning about the 1,000 civil society organizations in the World Justice Project's forum, their resource forum, and those are folks who are on the front lines advancing the rule of law and in no small part for that work under siege. And the restrictions that we're going to be talking about today are making it more difficult for us to do the work that all of us here at the forum are committed to doing. I think it's also a critically important topic for us as those of us who are lawyers, and I recognize and applaud the forum for convening a multidisciplinary collection of folks, but I think a fair number of us are, in fact, lawyers, stand accused. But I think one of the challenges that this topic presents to those of us who are lawyers is that what we see is what was described this morning as the weaponization of law. It's and co-option of the rule of law agenda to then be turned around and used against us. And that's really disturbing that somehow we've allowed that to happen as lawyers. For laws and regulations on their face, potentially legitimate, to then be misused and abused to repress civil society. So those are the challenges that we're going to be grappling with today. And we're going to take to heart the admonition we heard this morning. We're not just going to talk about the problems, we're also going to spend a bit of time talking about solutions and brainstorming among ourselves and hopefully with you to identify solutions to this very significant challenge. I've got an all-star panel to help us address this topic today, drawn from civil society and the front lines of this effort. First, to my immediate right, we have Sriskandarajah, who's Secretary General of CIVICUS, which is based in Australia, but is a global civil society alliance, and among other things, leads the work on the Civil Society Monitor that Danny will be drawing on to describe for all of us what we're seeing in terms of this shrinking space for civil society. Next to Danny, we have Saskia Brechenmacher, who's an associate fellow in the Democracy and Rule of Law program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And among many other things, Saskia has recently authored a study that looked quite intensively at this challenge in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Russia. So three very different but equally challenging environments for civil society, and will benefit from her insights from that work. And on my far right, we have Ingrid Srinath, who is the director of the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University in India. And that is India's first academic center aiming to galvanize the ecosystem for philanthropy and social impact. And so we'll learn about I think some creative solutions there to our challenges. So looking forward to that. As I mentioned, we're going to start off with maybe the depressing part of our discussion, talking about the nature of the problem. And I think that's actually important. I was at a conference earlier this week and happened to talk to some folks who are not in our community of practice. Some folks from the private sector, and I said, I'm going to The Hague, I'm speaking at this conference, I'm talking, and they said, well, what are you talking about? I said, I'm closing space for civil society. blank expressions. They said, "What? What is that?" And and it happened on 3 different occasions in the course of one reception. And so that was striking to me, and an important reminder that those of us who are living this day to day maybe start to use shorthand and for what we're experiencing, and it's quite important to step back and elaborate that, identify it, diagnose it, and maybe try to avoid that shorthand. I think if something has taken on the status of a hashtag, like hashtag closing space, it's time to get rid of the terminology and use more plain speak. So we'll do some discussion about the nature of the problem first in a series of questions I have for our panel. And then we'll, in a second round of questions, focus on solutions. And then we'll open it up to all of you to chime in there, though please don't hesitate to raise your hand and interject at any point in our discussion. So let me begin then in setting the stage, defining and describing this problem with a question for Danny. So drawing on your work with CIVICUS and that network of hundreds of civil society organizations around the world and the CIVICUS Monitor, what are you seeing? What are the trends and what are some of the details of this phenomenon?
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Betsy. It's great to be here. It's particularly great to be here because, like many others, I signed a pledge to girl-cot all-male panels. And I'm really happy to be the token male on an all-girl panel. So I really liked the analogy that Juan Carlos used this morning about the rule of law being part of the immunity against a whole range of diseases. And if I could work on that analogy, I think there's 3 observations we would make when looking at the state of the world and civil society in it. 3 observations around the disease. One is that this disease of closing civic space is a variant of a virus or several viruses that we're very familiar with. For example, when we look at many countries in the world, much of this is about shutting down the ability of people to dissent. In some countries, it happens when political opposition has been so badly decimated that the only voices left in that country or that polity to speak up, to challenge power, are informal bits of civil society, whether that's NGOs, formally registered bits, or citizen movements of different forms. So I think from our perspective, it's very important to recognize the continuity between this phenomenon that we note today and several other things that we're worried about or have been worried about. Another example, of course, is that this happens in the context of an era of democratic decline. We know in many, many parts of the world, the fundamental institutions of democracy are being challenged, and the attacks on an independent and vocal civil society are part of that. The best example in broad historical terms is, of course, Central and Eastern Europe, where we had 25 years of fairly rapid, dramatic democratization, but we see in countries like Poland or Hungary today paring back. And at the forefront of that disease is the attacks on curbs on civil society. A second observation on the disease is that it has both legal manifestations and manifestations that go well beyond legal aspects. And I think it's really important to recognize the sort of the various tools that those who want to undermine civil society are using. And I think it's really important to note, and I think Saskia will talk a bit about the sort of the legal onslaught, particularly against organized bits of civil society that challenge our fundamental right to freedom of association, but also, of course, expression and assembly. And so I won't cover that too much, but suffice to say, I suspect most of us here will be very familiar with the legal manifestations. But in some ways, that's happening it's even more worrying because of the stuff that's going on that's less easy to pin down as being about fundamental freedoms or fundamental rights or about legal norms or legal practice. It's when a head of government or head of state publicly demonizes independent civil society. This is not a matter that can easily be challenged in a law, in a court of law. And I think Ingrid's going to talk a bit about one particular person who's very good at doing that in the Indian context. But we're seeing it all around the world. And it's not just senior public officials, it can be people populating the sort of entire spectrum of political institutions. It's about the ability of organizations to just function. The sort of bureaucratic red tape approach to shrinking civic space is gaining in popularity around the world. So, in Kenya, in Russia, in India, there have been administrative regulations that have been introduced that on paper look reasonable for any sensible government to impose. An Indian minister I met recently said, we just want everyone to play by the same rules. So that's why we've introduced a new set of regulations. Of course, that makes life particularly difficult for NGOs or civil society. And in the Kenyan case, the 950 organizations that were threatened with deregistration recently, a huge proportion of those were openly vocal or critical of the government. So this is targeting of dissent through bureaucratic measures. So there's a whole bunch of other non-legal means that are manifesting. And the third and final observation for the depressing bit of the conversation is that this is a pandemic. That this is not, perhaps it never was, but it certainly is not now, a phenomenon that's restricted to particular parts of the world, particularly in the global south. So if you look at the CIVICUS monitor that Betsy was talking about, which is a new tool that CIVICUS has co-created with a range of our partners, we have coverage of 195 countries. It's a monitor, it's almost in real time. We're logging developments, mostly threats to do with one of those three fundamental civic freedoms, assembly, association, and expression. And it makes for a depressing read because there are, we think, serious violations with regard to one or more of these civic freedoms in over 100 countries. On our monitor, we class countries on a 5-point scale from open to closed. Over 100 countries find themselves in the bottom 2 categories, where civic space, we believe, is closed or heavily repressed, a Turkey or a China. And of course, 3.2 billion of us live in one of those countries where we believe civic space is repressed or closed. But the reason I'm saying it's a pandemic is because I'm almost more worried about what's happening at the other end of the scale. That there are, of course, 26 countries in the world, we think, where civic space still remains open. They're tiny European countries in most part. They're home to a tiny number of people. And even in some of those countries, I would say, we're far from a civil society utopia where conditions for citizens to organize and mobilize are ideal. And we're seeing on challenges. New Zealand, like in almost every index, comes very near the top. I was there very recently where a member of parliament stood in parliament and openly demonized a protest movement, saying that these were liberal thugs who weren't interested in sort of the national interest. The same sort of traitor rhetoric discourse that we see in many other parts of the world. And of course, in very mature democracies, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, like Australia, by the way, all of those find themselves in the second tier of our 5-point ranking, we're very worried about, again, administrative onslaught to organizations that work on environmental rights or indigenous rights, bureaucratic and regulatory attacks, the same public discourse, not just to silence dissent, but to question the very right to dissent. And your fabulous president is extremely good at that as well. It's behind the discourse of attacking an independent press or independent critics is the implication that it's against the national interest to dissent in the first place. To convey this idea, and we're seeing it in many continental European countries, this idea that to dissent is a foreign part of a healthy democracy. Whereas for most of us, for almost those of us who value and cherish democracy and the rule of law, dissent is a fundamental and vital part of a healthy democracy. And that's where, in mature democracy, we're starting to see that shift in public narrative and public discourse. So those are 3 observations about the virus sweeping the world.
Okay, with that overview, we're now going to drill in on some particular country contexts, I think. And so, Saskia, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your findings were in the work on Ethiopia, Russia, and Egypt, and how is this playing out in those specific contexts? What kinds of impacts are you seeing on civil society there?
Sure. Perhaps just a caveat. I mean, the three countries I looked at in my research, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Russia, are definitely on the more extreme end of the spectrum. But I would nevertheless say that some of the tactics governments in these countries use, you can observe in other contexts, perhaps to a lesser degree, but it's a similar repertoire that I think a lot of people would recognize, even from very different political contexts. I tried to look a bit at the local impact, so how does this actually affect civil society organizations who try to go about their daily work, and whether that's challenging the government or whether it's delivering services, or it could be a whole range of things. And just to pick up what you mentioned, the administrative nature of the crackdown became very clear. There are differences between the three cases, with, for example, in Egypt, a lot more violence currently being employed against dissent, against civic activists, with the government feeling very acutely threatened. But nevertheless, attempts in all three countries to sort of regularize and legalize this type of crackdown, because in the long run, that's less costly for the government as well, if it's all sort of implemented in the legal regime. And what this means concretely for activists is that they spend a lot more time in more of their daily life just fighting very basic battles over registration, over funding, over even just reporting and monitoring of activities. All of that takes a lot of time and resources. Also just makes it more difficult to set up groups in the first place. Plus there's the constant threat of being deregistered that you referenced. And then the government's also quite clever about using those types of regulations to then target specific groups that they're particularly bothered by for whatever reason, through unannounced inspections, interrogations, and lawsuits. And we see this in Russia, for example, quite excessively with the foreign agent law that was basically implemented a few years ago, is being used very effectively to repeatedly drag activists into court, which means that they spend a lot of time just defending themselves and also challenging fines, which end up being very expensive in the long run. So I think that's a really important part of this crackdown, is just this regulatory nature and what this means for organizations on a daily basis. I think a second key impact, obviously funding restrictions, and we're seeing those across the board with governments restricting, making it more difficult to access foreign funding, particularly for political advocacy or policy work. So they typically tend to either impose a certain percentage, so you can, in Ethiopia, only 10% of your budget can come from foreign sources if you're engaged in a very wide range of somewhat politically related activities. And it's important to emphasize here that that's not just traditional sort of hardcore human rights work, but also work on gender equality, on environmental issues, conflict resolution. So basically anything that for the government has a sort of political angle. And what this means now in practice is that a lot of organizations either have had to shift their activities in order to keep their access to foreign funding, have had to shift to more technocratic local development work, or have had to try and locate more domestic sources of funding, which some people have welcomed as sort of a positive opportunity to perhaps shift towards more domestic funding sources. But the reality is, at least in the three cases I looked at, is that domestic funding tends to be extremely limited. So inevitably it means that organizations have to cut down their activities, sort of go back to the essentials, often have to let go of staff because they simply cannot replace the amount of funding that they previously used to receive from foreign sources. Some have been more innovative than others, trying to do crowdfunding, also trying to reach out to local businesses or do some income generating activities. But overall, I would say it's difficult, particularly because in all three countries I looked at, the private sector remains extremely hesitant to fund any type of work that could be perceived as political or politically sensitive, which is a massive issue. So even when you have private philanthropists, for example, in Russia, they tend to put their money toward charity work rather than something that could potentially anger the government. Then in terms of coping strategies, I just referenced one of them, which is sort of shifting your activities or trying to raise more local funding. But I think we also see now activists sort of trying to exploit legal loopholes in some contexts, either by registering as civil companies or law firms or social enterprises or setting up secondary branches, so trying to find their ways around restrictive laws, which can be a way to evade some restrictions in the short term. However, the concern is that in the long run, it's not really a permanent solution because governments often find ways of then cracking down at a later date, or even if it allows them to operate for a while. We see this now in Egypt with a lot of NGOs still registered as civil companies, for example. They're in this constant legal gray zone where at any point in time they could potentially be forced to re-register, and then it's not clear what will happen to the human rights organization. So it leaves them incredibly vulnerable. Perhaps another impact that's important to emphasize is that governments very strategically try to cut linkages between organizations, sort of the horizontal ties between activists, between different parts of civil society, which are so crucial for vibrant civil society, because you really need the types of umbrella groups and associations that bring people together to aggregate voices, particularly to influence policy at a more national level. And we see, first of all, there are obviously resource challenges. If you don't have resources to do your own work, it becomes more difficult to collaborate with others. But there are also very specific regulations and restrictions that target umbrella groups that make it more difficult to collaborate with trade unions or political parties, and they're sort of aimed at isolating NGOs and other types of civic organizations from each other, and also making it more difficult for them to access public institutions and public policymakers and actually political representatives, so trying to cut those vertical linkages as well and international linkages. And I think that's, perhaps we can come back to that later, a crucial area where also international support can be quite helpful in trying to maintain some of these linkages and solidarity between groups.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's turn then to Ingrid and the Indian experience.
So this phrase that you use, the weaponization of laws, I think very few governments have turned their armory, if you will, of laws against civil society as effectively as the Indian government has. And quite often we tend to focus on the FCRA, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, as if that's the single instrument that is constraining civil society by constraining foreign funding. It is a huge weapon that the Indian government uses. It dates back, interestingly, to 1976, when Indira Gandhi instituted it as a way to prevent foreign interference in Indian politics, because she sort of was the proponent of the great foreign hand in her own downfall. It's sort of morphed over time to become an anti-terror thing when that was fashionable, or when that became fashionable with the Financial Action Task Force. It was then extended to NGOs. And in its most recent avatar, it now covers student groups, farmers groups, women's groups, everyone, in fact, except political parties who've been let off the hook. So in some senses, the law is now the reverse of what it was originally intended to be. In the 40-something years that this law has existed, I have yet to find a single case where an NGO has been found guilty of funding terror or interfering in an election or violating any of the stated provisions of this law. And if you look at the NGOs that have been targeted by a withdrawal of the FCRA or a freezing of their bank accounts, invariably it's like a list of prominent dissenters. So there is nobody there that's a bad accountant. There's nobody there who's failed to file a report until very recently. Since this government came to power, what changed was the scale on which this was happening. So in the 3 years they've been in power, the number of organizations entitled to receive foreign funds has gone from something near 40,000 to under 13,000. Close to 30,000 organizations have, in one way or the other, been deregistered. And the new phenomenon is the targeting of foreign funders themselves. So everyone from the Ford Foundation, OSF, National Endowment for Democracy, Compassion International, Greenpeace. This is sort of the new element of this, which is the use of the FCRA to shut off, to target foreign funders themselves. And it's sort of the backward integrating it. So it's not just the activist anymore that is targeted, it's the activist funders, it's the activist lawyers, it's the anyone up the value chain, if you will, is now vulnerable. And this has a huge chilling effect. I mean, when I worked at HEVOS, for example, none of our lawyers or chartered accountants or banks would talk to me on the phone. They just assumed that my phone calls were being listened to and that my email was being read and so on. Banks wouldn't open a bank account for you because they don't want to get involved. Why would they want to take on this unnecessary, legal and other minefield in order to open a bank account for some NGO? But it's not just FCRA. Offline and online freedom of assembly in the form of laws that prevent gatherings of people, or internet shutdowns. India now holds a record for the number of internet shutdowns that happen in a particular year. So, and it's not just the number of shutdowns, it's the length of them. So in Kashmir, for example, there was a period of almost 6 months when the internet was shut down. So not just freedom of expression, but freedom of association, the ability to organize itself is sort of choked off there. And then there's the IT Act, which is ostensibly designed to prevent pornography and phishing and so on, but has been weaponized, if you will, so that even cartoonists now find themselves in jail because they've offended somebody. And of course, there's the best one of them all is the sedition law. This was a law that, again, entirely ironically, the British wrote for Gandhi, which has now been turned against civil society, which is just, I mean, it defies imagination. There are cases where, I mean, there's one case, for example, of a 10-year-old boy that's been charged with sedition because he attended a protest against a nuclear plant. There's the activist that actually organized that campaign against that nuclear plant has 300 separate cases that he's fighting. So effectively, he's been paralyzed. I mean, he would probably, you know, the courts will find him innocent on all of those 300 cases. But in the interim, he's completely paralyzed. His family is being hounded by journalists and by others. He's had all his bank accounts frozen, his passport taken away. And the message that it sends out to civil society at large, that it doesn't even matter whether you're guilty or innocent. If we decide we don't like you, this is what you could possibly be facing. And so you want to think twice, if you will, about doing this sort of thing. And finally, there's, paradoxically again, we have the first law in the world which requires businesses over a certain size to donate 2% of their net income to NGOs. So it's sort of compulsory corporate philanthropy, if you will. If you combine the fact that all the funders of human rights that were foreigners have been shut down or constrained, and then you say to civil society, the only new money that's coming into your sector is going to come from business, you effectively say to civil society, you'd never want to take on business, you never want to criticize business, you never want to be known as anti-business, because then the only other source of money you have, now that your foreign friends are gone, will also be unavailable to you. And lastly, there's the worst law of them all, is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which has run now in Kashmir and in the Northeast for, I don't know, decades, which essentially gives the army impunity from everything. I mean, rape, murder, abduction. You can't, if your 12-year-old son disappears in Kashmir or in Manipur, you have no way of knowing whether they were kidnapped, killed, have run away to Delhi. You have absolutely no way of even investigating this because the army has full impunity. And then there's so you sort of took care of civil society that way and business in a sense. If you look at the media, between the dependence on the media for corporate advertising and the fact that most Indian media is now owned by big business, and the fact that Mr. Modi, for example, my Prime Minister, does not do media interviews anymore. He does not do press conferences. This will sound familiar to some of you Western countries. He operates mostly on Twitter and has very selective access to journalists. So if you want access to Mr. Modi, or you don't want to have government advertising taken away from you, or you don't want an income tax inquiry against you, it's clear what you have to do as a media house. So you silence civil society, you then take out the media. The judiciary, and this was something that Justice Ginsburg talked about yesterday, which one of the traditions has been that when you retire, you retire. There's no possibility of another government appointment for a Supreme Court judge, for example. Recently, for the first time in India's independent history, a Supreme Court judge was appointed a governor of a state, which again sends the message that, well, if you do the right thing, you know, you could have their perks attached to this. And then finally, there's the sort of non-judicial set of threats, which is we have an army of trolls online. We referenced this in this morning's panel as well, paid and unpaid. Some do it out of voluntary admiration, apparently, for our government. But if you, I mean, I've experienced this personally. I mean, it wasn't even a particularly partisan policy. It was juvenile justice, you know, which is really quite non-partisan. But I expressed a point of view on it, and before I knew it, I was being called names, people were threatening to rape me, people were sharing my address online, people were targeting my family. And when you have government ministers using terms like prostitute to describe journalists they don't like, or non-governmental people, online shows that are clear, that have the Indian flag as their egg equivalent, using the term NG whore, that's a whole other level of assault. And it's online violence, it's verbal violence, but it's also the threat of offline violence. Rationalists have been assassinated. We have these drive-by shootings of people whose sole agenda is secularism. You know, these are not terrorists by any stretch of imagination. 4 of them have been killed by anonymous assassins. Nobody has been brought to justice. And the most recent manifestation are what we're calling lynchings, which is essentially self-appointed vigilantes murdering people by beating them to death or otherwise. Almost all of these people are Muslim. The excuse used is that they ate beef, or they traded in beef, or they broke some law relating to beef. And the police response has been to forensically check the meat they were eating to ascertain whether it was beef or not. So, you almost victimize the victim. The victim is now the criminal. So there's a set of factors, I think, legal and extra-legal, that are combining to create a very, very hostile environment for civil society. And it's the demonization, the discrediting. For example, every 6 to 8 weeks, punctually, there's a report that runs in some newspaper about how there are 3.3 million NGOs in India and how only 20,000 of them submitted FCRA returns. Legally, only the 20,000 who are registered for FCRA need to submit returns. And so there's this story that runs unchallenged. Week after week, journalists print this up without ever pushing back against it, even though it's completely erroneous. Our Prime Minister coined the term 5-star activist to describe all of us that travel to meetings like this. And to him, the only non-5-star activist, or to qualify as a non-5-star activist, you would have to spend at least 2 nights a year in a forest without a toilet. So if there's this, but what I think that the greatest danger in India right now, and in multiple other countries, because Saskia's report just, I was going down the list saying check, 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 is that we may be losing the middle class. When the average middle class person in India has been subjected to this barrage of disinformation for so long, that I think most middle class people are starting to believe that NGOs are inept, inefficient, corrupt, and possibly anti-national. I mean, that's sort of become the labels that are associated with the term NGO.
Okay, so much there to follow up on. I do want to, not to dwell on the depressing part of our conversation, but I do want to ask a couple of follow-ups. I use the word pandemic. I think, Denny, you did as well. Do we see these trends literally being transmitted country to country? What are the vehicles for that transmission of this disease? Any of you?
Well, I know India's FCRA has been emulated in Pakistan recently and a number of other countries. So governments which are, it's so hard to get replication of a development program that works. So you do a really good thing in healthcare or education, it's so hard to convince countries around the world to adopt it. But you come up with a new way of controlling civil society, and within a year, you've got 12 other countries immediately replicating it. So they're really good at learning from each other on this thing. And the word prostitute, for example, was actually coined by Sarah Palin, I believe. So we've just adopted it and given it scale.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's definitely diffusion and learning happening. It's sometimes hard to trace it exactly, but you see it when very similar language pops up from country to country and similar laws are being put forward. And we also saw several different waves of sort of legislative and non-judicial harassment following initially after the Orange revolutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, but there's a whole wave of restrictive legislation being put forward, and then again after the Arab Spring, when you saw especially sort of semi-authoritarian countries being particularly worried, because as Danny mentioned, in a lot of these countries, political opposition is relatively weakened, so civic organizations are really the primary threat to whatever entrenched power holders they are. So you do see sort of different ways, and I think you also see it around certain issues, like for example now anti-terror legislation spreading very rapidly again through sub-Saharan Africa, but also other parts of the world. Again, partly because it is being sort of put forward at the international level, but then you also see countries learning from each other how you can use that this anti-terror rhetoric and also anti-terror laws to crack down on dissent quite effectively. I would mention, though, that there are some variations between different regions where the threats look somewhat different. And I think Central America, for example, and Latin America is a good example. Sometimes we suggest that the region hasn't been as affected by the same trend. But actually, you see a lot of pressure on civic activists in Central America and Latin America, especially also from non-state actors and criminal actors, but also private sector actors and companies, especially against environmental activists and land rights activists. So it doesn't mean that the civic space is doing great, just the threat looks slightly different. And it is obviously exacerbated by the degree of impunity and the fact that governments are either complicit or not capable of pushing back against these threats.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say there's informal, formal, and political collaboration going on. So the informal thing, I mean, I haven't seen it, but apparently the very early piece of legislation in Ethiopia still had the word Russia in it, because someone had copied and pasted the piece of draft legislation. There's formal mechanisms like, particularly around anti-terrorism, this Financial Action Task Force or some of the internet regulation type forums are being used by states, who find common cause in trying to, having to restrict or control, manage these new spaces. And then the political bit is the interesting one. Several leaders who've embarked on foreign funding restrictions have used the fact that the world's oldest foreign funding restriction regulation is, of course, that of the United States from the 1920s, I believe. And the example, some of you who are DC-based will remember the Center for Global Development and its sponsorship for a project on forestry by Norway, hitting the press in DC as a sort of foreign influence of American politics. That's picked up very quickly by other leaders who say, look at these guys. David Cameron, soon after the riots in London, just mentioned the idea that perhaps the state would surveil Twitter and social media. Within hours, that was being cited as an example of excuse for other leaders to say, well, we're going to do this as well, because look, David Cameron's talking about it. So that copycat behavior is happening at all sorts of levels.
Let me just pick up on the non-state actor piece of this. Other than Central America, is that a significant component of the phenomenon, or mostly is this coming from states?
I think it is a significant component. I mean, I think you especially see it around natural resources and land issues, because that's where private sector interests clash most directly with civic activists, and I'm sure India is a good case for that as well. But I also think it fits into sort of the informal harassment piece, and I saw this very clearly when I did my research in Russia, that a lot of the violence and violent harassment of activists is not necessarily very clearly coming from state actors, but is coming from radical extremist right-wing actors who are definitely encouraged by the sort of demonization put forward by state actors. So even if you cannot directly link it back to, that was the Secret Service or this was a public official, those are groups that are flourishing in the current Russian environment in which that kind of demonization and violence is encouraged. And also where police is not really following up on those crimes, end up turning it against the activists themselves, accusing them of extremism. So I think there's also an important piece about which kind of violent non-state actors flourish in those kind of environments.
Certainly in India, some of the worst violence against activists has come from non-state actors, particularly extractive industries or natural resource-based industries in central India, which is also what we call where our tribal communities live. Not quite, indigenous doesn't quite work for us, it's slightly different. And the combination, in fact, the entire struggle with Greenpeace started because of their opposition to a project that was owned by some crony capitalist friends of our current Prime Minister. There was even a theory being put forward that another crony capitalist crony of his was in trouble in Australia, and that Greenpeace was a significant actor there, and so there was the decision in a sense to go after Greenpeace in India where they could, because they couldn't in Australia. So yeah, extractive industries, nuclear energy, coal and other energy-based are a hot zone, if you will, for the non-state actor targeting of civil society in cahoots with government. So it's not, they know they're going to get away with it because they've got government on their side.
And why do we see this happening now? What are the
How long do we have?
What are the drivers? Danny?
Okay, lots of things. I think, as I said, in some contexts, the shutting down of official opposition forces has led to civil society organizations or formations becoming the effective opposition. And so states or those in power, strongmen leaders in particular, are going after them. I think partly there is this, amidst the democratic decline, which scholars talk about, is this peculiar thing that's been happening in the last few years, which is the sort of regressive political environment where another form of non-state actor, the political party, has pushed us in many countries, whether it's the Philippines, as we heard this morning, or India, the UK, many countries in continental Europe, into a much more regressive political environment, which is where norms around human rights, democracy, social justice are being challenged. So even if you don't have victory by the far right, they've sufficiently engaged or changed the political landscape. And it's coming back to the sort of winning the hearts and minds of the middle classes across the world, whether it's in India or in Ireland, there's a sort of challenge there. I do feel for policymakers because I think there's one or several aspects of these trends which I can imagine are genuinely difficult. I mean, how do you regulate the internet? This is not a simple or easy task. I happen to think that in most cases they've gone too far in a sort of overly restrictive. But the internet, for example, or online space has created some really tough political or policy choices. So those are a few drivers. One other one, I suppose, is that there has been, to Mr. Modi's critique of five-star activists, we in the professionalized international bits of civil society are partly to blame because we have created a cadre of organizations that are more accountable to donors, often in the global north, than to the communities they claim to serve. And an Indian colleague says they're good at accountability, but not accountability. And that has left many of us, in many contexts, exceptionally vulnerable to political attack because it's easy to demonize these guys because actually they do spend a lot of their time on planes or in boardrooms and hardly in communities and streets. Now, I don't think that's the overwhelming factor here, but it's part of the vulnerability.
It's almost like there's a paradox in a way. On the one hand, we could see this as a function of civil society success, right? It's because civil society is powerful that states are reacting and shutting it down. On the other hand, it could be a sign of a failure, right? Of not building our constituencies sufficiently to be resilient against this.
I would add to that sort of the current rise of populist narratives and politics in a number of countries is contributing to that, because they are very good at taking advantage of precisely that legitimacy problem and obviously completely exaggerating it, but turning sort of demands for legitimacy around and asking civil society, well, who are you accountable to? Who elected you? Particularly if they're playing that sort of majoritarian card, we're representing the majority against unaccountable elites, and we're sort of the silenced popular will that's now coming to power, and then they're very effective at turning that against particularly foreign-funded NGOs, claiming that they're somehow foreign elements and don't actually represent popular interests in that country. And that gets particularly difficult when those NGOs are representing or advocating for minority interests like LGBT rights or refugee rights, for example, that maybe don't even have majority support, but nevertheless fit into the sort of democratic rights spectrum. So I think that's also a contributor, not everywhere, but in a number of countries, such as in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment.
Okay. All right, thoroughly depressed. Let's turn to responses. And maybe Saskia, I can come back to you. How is the international community responding? Are there bilateral initiatives, multilateral initiatives, private sector initiatives, civil society networks that are proving effective in response?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's important to note that the issue is just has received much more international attention over the past several years, and that's been really remarkable, even over the past 2 years, just how much more high-level international attention there is, and that it's no longer just framed as a very sort of niche human rights topic, as it was when I first started paying attention to this, but now it's much more broadly accepted that this is part of a broader democratic problem we're having, and that's bringing new actors into the discussion, which I think is a really good trend. And sort of the work the UN Rapporteur for right to freedom of assembly and association has done wonderful work drawing attention to this, and organizations like CIVICUS and ICNL, and also the Obama administration sent with civil society initiative, just kind of efforts to bring this up to a high level international attention. A second, I think, important thing to emphasize is that a lot of donors and funders have in fact adapted and been adapting over the past several years in important ways, both bilateral and multilateral donors and also private funders. And I would say that falls into different kind of buckets. On the one hand, they've tried to make their funding a bit more flexible and make more emergency funding available. As we all know, it can be quite hard to access certain pots of funding, especially for civil society activists that need it very quickly because they're in some difficult situation. And I think there's been positive movement in that respect. And also to make more core funding available to really strengthen civil society organizations over longer periods of time when they're feeling under pressure. So I think that's generally been quite successful. There's always more you can do, and there's also variations between donors, with some being more traditional, a bit more worried about upsetting state actors and therefore more careful about what they're doing, and others more confrontational and willing to fund unregistered actors and do more innovative things like remote funding and remote work if they've been expelled from the country and things like that, and also much more investment in digital security. And I think those are all positive trends. I think what the problem is that I see to some degree, and I completely sympathize why it's very difficult, is that I think we've been more successful on the emergency response side of things than in the long-term preventative, how do we actually support positive enabling environment side. And that's just because I think we're still struggling to understand what that really means in practice and how to operationalize it. So I think that's a huge challenge. It's just in the long run, how do we actually help support civil society in spaces where maybe even now they're not under threat, but they might be in 10 years, and kind of create those more resilient civil society organizations. And outside actors will always it's always limited what they can do, but I think there's more work to be done on that side. And then another challenge I would say is sort of connecting the funder response to the political and diplomatic side, which is also difficult. And I think there's some examples where there's been very effective diplomatic pushback at the highest level, but that usually happens only if different interests sort of come together, and more often than not you see the human rights interests the interests donors or donor countries have in supporting human rights clashing with security and economic and trade interests, for example, and then suddenly it becomes much more difficult to actually speak out at the highest level, whether it is in public or even in private, against potential threats to freedom of association. And Ethiopia, for example, is an important case where it's just been very challenging, and there hasn't been a whole lot of pressure on the Ethiopian government because of various sort of security interests, as well as strong development cooperation links that have sort of come in the way of that. So I think connecting those two sides, that remains a big challenge. And I also think with the new US government, sort of no longer probably taking the lead on the issue, there's a bit of a leadership gap where perhaps this is a time for European countries or other non-Western democracies that are not affected by the symptom to step up a bit more. And that's obviously challenging if Europe itself is struggling with these issues domestically. So I think maybe that's something we can discuss more going forward. And then lastly, maybe, I mean, there's always coordination challenges, and that's just, it's difficult to get lots of people together to take coordinated action. Every institution has its own sort of domestic incentives, institutional, bureaucratic incentives and mechanisms. And I think there's been forward movement within different circles, and you see that with private funders coordinating more and governments talking to each other more, but kind of, I think there's still barriers and things that could be done better to have actually, if there are threats emerging in a particular country, to have a more coordinated approach rather than everyone reacting individually. And then how to bring the private sector, and I think that's a whole other issue because it's just difficult, and I think there's much more that could be done there too. Obviously, acknowledging that the private sector is very diverse and there's some actors within it that might be much more open to these challenges, and others are in fact part of the problem. So
which multilateral fora would you see being best suited to that kind of coordination?
I'm not sure there's a single one. I mean, perhaps you can speak to that as well. I think the UN has been effective at just raising it at the international level, but I think for concrete specific action, the more smaller circles are sometimes more helpful than the very high level ones.
In its heyday, Community of Democracies was a good forum for this sort of thing.
Yeah, so I would say there's different forums that could potentially be taken.
Probably for different aspects of the problem as well. Okay, Danny, coordination is your bread and butter within CIVICUS, and tell us a little bit about how that movement is rallying around this and supporting each other.
Okay, so I think the good news, the silver lining in all of this is that it has really brought civil society together. I mean, I work in a civil society alliance. We have members in 180 countries. And even in the 4.5 years I've been doing this role, I've not seen these levels of engagement, solidarity across big and small, formal and informal, north and south bits of civil society, and that's great. We're actually incubating a new coalition called VUCA, which is the Zulu word for arise or awake, which involves not just the NGO community, but faith groups, which are starting to be affected in some countries, trade unions, which are obviously very affected, journalist associations, and this idea that we need to stand together is becoming very important. I mean, even the biggest, most well-resourced international NGOs are feeling the bite. And you know, they've got substantial resources, many of these guys, and so they're starting to come together. I do think, though, that and one of our challenges, for example, in this VUCA coalition is around hearts and minds. I mean, I think it comes back to this, if this is in many cases, or in almost all cases, a domestic political battle, if you will, around the discourse of the role of an independent and vibrant civil society, then, you know, as I often find myself saying, you can't, I mean, this can't be saved from outside. Civic space cannot be saved, quote unquote, from outside.
In fact, outside assistance might exacerbate the problem.
Exactly. And so it almost, I mean, it comes back to, I mean, I agree that there are some important intergovernmental or multilateral fora in which this is happening. It's very important that there is solidarity and a more diverse set of voices speaking out. But actually, the best and most important starting point has to be from the polity in a country with legitimate and accountable actors in that polity trying to challenge some of the sort of discourse, the negative, regressive discourse in this area. Civil society, in its traditional formations, hasn't been particularly good at that sort of stuff. We've stayed away from politics, or we've been worried about the boardroom, not the streets. But there are, of course, lots of other very interesting bits of civil society that are starting to do that. So I think there is a coordination challenge. It's also fascinating to see. I mean, again, if I just think back for the last 4.5 years, when I first started, the statements that we would produce, the alerts, the press releases, would have been about Ethiopia or Rwanda or Russia. These days, we're producing statements about Hungary or the United States. The watch list of our CIVICUS monitor in April featured the United States alongside Turkey and a couple of other countries in the global south. Because this is, again, comes back to the sort of pandemic, the universality of what we're seeing, which is actually driving some really interesting new forms of solidarity even within civil society, which I think is a positive. You know, the old north, south, west, rest type binaries don't work so easily in this particular issue.
Okay. Ingrid,
Well, it's certainly
perfect segue to you.
having a shared threat in a sense is bringing groups that wouldn't otherwise collaborate together. So in India, you're seeing different grassroots movements start to work together. So movements of indigenous people with movements that are more minority groups, movements of women, movements of Dalits, lower caste groups, suddenly forming coalitions that would have been unthinkable even a couple of years ago. The other really interesting thing is every new action they take recruits a new generation of activists, if you will. So for example, the stuff that they've been doing on the internet with censorship and surveillance and privacy issues and so on has suddenly widened the pool of civil society actors. And these guys are really good at organizing online and crowdfunding. And so they're sort of bringing a whole new energy and a whole new set of tools to civil society and a new set of sympathizers, if you will, that you know, really last year these were die-hard libertarians who wouldn't be seen in the same room as some more left-leaning people that constitute the mainstream of civil society. I think we're not doing enough, certainly. Oh, sorry, there's also the domestic philanthropy. I think in India, we're certainly starting to see now, over the last 2 years particularly, Indian philanthropists beginning to, and it's small, early days yet, but paradoxically, most of them are women, starting to fund some of the stuff that is politically controversial or that's risky. That the old school philanthropists perhaps stayed away from. And we're doing a piece of research, for example, at the university for a philanthropist who has asked us to unpack this whole foreign funding thing to really give her a tool that she can take to fellow philanthropists and say, this is the stuff that's now under-resourced because of the foreign funding clampdown. And this is therefore what we ought to be. So she sort of volunteered, if you will, to become an advocate for that sort of funding. But we certainly haven't done enough, as Saskia said, on the longer term stuff. It's still very knee-jerk, very reactive. In particularly resourcing the civil society infrastructure piece. So everything from networks, associations, the lack of those has really hurt us. Because the ability of civil society to respond to these threats in the absence of a functioning NGO association, in the absence of a functioning philanthropic network. So no ACLU equivalent, no Council on Foundations equivalent, no NCRP equivalent, not even, if you will, a foundation center equivalent. So the lack of data, the lack of evidence, the lack of platforms has really hurt. And one of the things I'm hoping for is that kind of work will start to find more resources as a result of this threat.
Okay, great. I am eager to open it up to the audience here, so begin to think about your questions, and someone maybe has a mic. But let me just, while you're getting organized there, one question for you, Danny. Your recent annual report focused in particular on the private sector. We heard about the private sector as a source of a problem, but you also put forward there some recommendations about the private sector being part of the solution. How has that been received? Is it getting traction? And particularly in the context of business and human rights and the guiding principles and all of that, what hope do we find there?
So you're right, our latest State of Civil Society report, just published a few weeks ago, takes the theme of civil society and the private sector. I think I'm fairly optimistic about the response that we've been getting from, it's sort of progressive business who are interested in human rights, and as Saskia says, this has become another aspect of that human rights agenda, and it's great to see some of those guys take this on. B, I think they're, again, amongst progressive businesses, there's an intuitive understanding that you have to have an open and free civic space in order to stabilize democracy, and that's in the long-term interests of business sustainability. And I think that there are some creative examples where, as one of our South African colleagues says, businesses go beyond painting classrooms as their charity. And that there are examples where enlightened businesses are pooling funds through blind trusts and things like that to support citizen action in contexts where it would be otherwise political suicide for them to do this openly. So I think I'm optimistic about some of that. Don't get me wrong, there is the collusion between political and economic elites, especially when it comes to resource extraction or economic monopolization, is driving some of what we're seeing. But for every bad business, there seems to be some good businesses who are interested in talking on these issues.
Okay, great. We'll start with a question here. Please identify yourself.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Hector Soliman. I come from Philippines, and I think my country qualifies as part of the pandemic that Dr. Dani has been talking about. I actually have a few reflections based on what the first reflection that I have is the use of the word prostitute, which Ingrid here has spoken about, and that resonates to my country very, very much. I don't know whether it was of Indian origin, of Filipino origin, or whatever origin, but that seems to be a statement that is now being used widely to demonize media in their attempt to uncover the truth. So that's my first statement. Our moderator has asked what seems to be the driver behind this very grim picture that we are seeing now. And I was kind of struck by that statement, and I think that stifling dissent has now led to a certain insidious form of authoritarianism that is very intolerant of other voices. But what we are seeing now, at least in my country, I can safely say that authoritarianism is now producing an insidious form of cronyism. In other words, it seems to me that the powers that be are now pulling in a lot of money, especially from China, and giving it to their own friends, at very concessional rates and, without public bidding. So I think this is something that we should look into, that it's not only I don't think they're only such stifling dissent just for the heck of it. I think there's some economic gains that have to be made with an unaccountable government, and I think that is something that we have to look into. There are 2 points that I'd like to also to make with respect to the possible responses. The first one is that we do have an NGO back home that is an online fact-checking NGO. Because of all the false, misinformation and false news that are coming out, that are used to demonize and weaponize and bamboozle legitimate dissent, there is now arising a need for somebody also online to say, that is not correct. According to statistics, according to history, it has become so bad in Philippines that sometimes people post photos, like for example, I remember that they were saying that this is a photo taken, just like yesterday, and we are now giving rise to as emergency relief, while the old government was only giving a cup of rice. It turns out that that particular photo was linked to a Taiwanese NGO that was doing work like 5 years ago. So the photo is entirely false, but this fact-checking group was saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not correct. This is the link. You can check that this photo was not taken yesterday, it was taken 5 years ago, etc., etc. My last point is that in returning authoritarian regimes that, like my country, I think there is a heightened fear factor that we have to deal with because, rampant extrajudicial killings, people being harassed in the media openly, etc. So I think one approach that we are trying to do is, I thought of something to label it. It's like creating safe spaces for solidarity. Because people who are, fear that they might be the next victim, that they might be bashed online, etc., I think need some sort of safe space where they can discuss, what's happening to us, why is there so many lies going on in the media, what can we do about it? It's like reconnecting to one another. So I think this is one theme that we can think about in order to push back and create more spaces for civil society. Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent suggestions. The point about online fact-checking brings to mind an initiative that ABA President-elect Hilary Bass has been talking about within the ABA, organizing a legal fact-check initiative, because that's a challenge that we have seen in the U.S. Question here, David.
So excuse me, David Karen. I was struck in the beginning by two statements, Ingrid and Danny, where Danny seemed to emphasize the stifling of dissent as characteristic of what's happening in this pandemic. And at the same time, Ingrid pointed to a wider spillover regarding NGOs generally, no matter what they're doing. And it led me to think that the panels very aptly named that about the shrinking of the space generally. There's a lot going on in the space that in no way threatens the state or is a question of dissent. And so the thought experiment I have is partly for Danny, but maybe for all of you, and does it help? I find very helpful in the Rule of Law Index, where they have that spider diagram, and they've taken the idea of rule of law and blown it out in 90 ways. And you can see how countries differ in many ways, but I'm wondering here, what is happening in the civic space? Which areas are really targeted in this? If you had sort of the arts, education, agriculture, but as it come around to political voice, which one is targeted? And if Danny was doing this over time, instead of 3 charts, 3 categories to your ranking, would you see that all the space is shrinking, that somehow, or is it just selective application, a measure of general application potentially, but they only target certain groups in its execution? Or does it, as Ingrid's suggesting, really change the attitude generally so that even someone who's supporting traveling art exhibits would find they're having difficulty in doing things, that it's somehow suspect? And so I'm just wondering how we break apart a panel that could be talking about stifling dissent versus a panel that's talking about shrinking the public civic space.
Excellent. Danny, do you want to react?
Yeah, you did promise that you'd ask me a hard question. So, I think that the reasons why we say that dissent is what's at stake here is that in many parts of the world, conditions for certain types of civil society are getting better. So if you take the global south, sub-Saharan African countries, for example, service delivery organizations are central to national development plans. I mean, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, civil society delivers more money, vast amounts of services. I mean, I think in Nigeria, civil society is responsible for more water and sanitation projects than the government is, with Western or donor funding. So there is a recognition that it's bits of civil society are essential to national development. But I suppose it comes back to the discourse and the demonization, which is to say service delivery, good causes, good, politics, advocacy, dissent, bad. And that is the universal aspect of this. We saw just last year in the United Kingdom a Cabinet Office directive that was published on a Saturday morning, in which the Cabinet Office minister said that if any NGO receiving government funds could not use those funds to influence the political or policy-making process. Happily, after much lobbying, few months later, the directive disappeared. But it's this idea of framing civil society as, good causes, good, advocacy, dissent, politics, bad. And I think that's what we're playing for here, this ability, this right of civil society to be independent, to be vocal, to be critical. If you were asking, you did ask about which bits of civil society are particularly affected. I think we've between us listed a whole range. Those who are championing the rights of minorities, particularly controversial sort of political aspects of minority rights. Organisations involved in accountability of any form, whether it's around business accountability or sort of political accountability, are at the coalface of this. But just quickly to say, there is one intellectual challenge that I am still grappling with in this area, which is that there is no, I said earlier that there's no civil society utopia. In a simple sense, that's because in every country things can get bad and there are, things can go relatively better or worse. But intellectually, it's also because it's difficult to say exactly, to define narrowly the contours of what good civic life is. You could argue that in apartheid South Africa, civil society and citizen action was incredibly strong because people were organising and mobilising in amazing ways in extremely difficult conditions. So if you were trying to build an index of civic activism, South Africa might in the apartheid era have scored highly, but it's not the sort of civic life that we wanted to promote. And there's an intellectual contradiction there around, is civic space, is civil society a means or an end, and how do you, or both?
Mm-hmm. One tool that we're proposing to launch shortly is a civil society confidence index, exactly like a business confidence index. So, and there's another organization I know that's doing a sort of an ease of doing civil society, if you will, again, like the ease of doing business index. So there's two instruments. The civil society confidence index would specifically ask civil society leaders, what is the outlook for resources? What's the outlook for talent? What's the outlook on regulation? So you would get a detailed diagnostic of what is changing and how it's changing. And I think the ease of doing civil society piece that's coming out of an organization in Hong Kong is really looking at the regulatory piece and then making that direct comparison to business. So, the Indian government, for example, is very proud every time its ranking on ease of doing business goes up. So to sort of juxtapose that then with its falling ranking, if you will, on ease of doing civil society is one way to push back against that narrative.
It's going to be a really interesting tool when it comes out. I suspect that, to your point, Danny, it will show in many places, most places, the most acute problems for those who are trying to express dissent. But I think it's a broader phenomenon as well, and I think to your point, David, finding how that plays out in different contexts. I know, for example, in Washington, Interaction, which is a network of mostly humanitarian development organizations, is now made one of its 3 or 4 strategic priorities working on closing space for civil society because its constituents are being affected by this. In Turkey recently, the new focus of a crackdown there is on humanitarian organizations providing assistance to Syrian refugees who are now being the focus of investigation, fines, being expelled from the country. So I think there's a lot of variation that this tool will reveal.
Yeah, perhaps just to echo what you said, but also add to it that in a number of places we do see this bifurcation with government sort of trying to divide civil society into good and bad, but still trying to exert control even over those who are doing service delivery. And I think both Russia and Egypt are good examples of that, where in Russia, service delivery organizations aren't really feeling the same kind of pressure, but there's a lot of pressure from the government for them to organize in state-controlled forums and try and influence policy only in state-controlled forums. So there's still this sort of effort to put them under government control and for them to deliver services according to government plans. And similarly, now in Egypt, we see massive crackdown on religious charities and organizations because those are seen as not being sort of under government control. They're potentially affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, so they present a political threat, even though what they're doing is essentially just delivering services. So I think this notion of control still remains a big issue. And then the second thing is that we do see NGO laws that are being implemented. They do affect everyone, even if the funding regulations potentially just affect a sort of a narrow group of political or politically oriented NGOs. The sort of registration rules, the administrative a burden, the fact that you need to get government permission to do anything, that affects everyone. And in Egypt now as well, a lot of development NGOs are struggling to get permits for their development work. They're struggling to get funding permits, etc. So you see an overall impact, particularly on smaller, less well-resourced organizations. So I think it's a really important issue that does affect a broader range of organizations.
Okay. Question here.
Thank you for the talk, and I have a reflection which I've been trying the last few minutes to formulate in the form of a question so as to avoid the usual problem, but it relates to abortion in Ireland. It's kind of the context I was going to say, which is the next big public debate in Ireland that will manifest in terms of, in all likelihood, a constitutional referendum next year. And my thought and my question is that much of what the debate that's going to happen over the next 12 months is going to be about, there's going to be a substantive debate, and there's going to be about access to the public space for groups that want to contribute to that substantive debate, both those who want to liberalise Ireland's abortion law and those who want to, at the very least, maintain it as it is. And to formulate my thought as a question would be, to what extent do civil society groups need to be aware of their own complicity? And I can say our own complicity because in a personal capacity I will take part in that debate with one of the groups in trying to push other groups out of that space. You know, we talk about, it's easy when it's dissent, when one is protesting against a government doing something illiberal, but when the government is the ostensible referee in something that it should be, in theory, neutral, the state in Ireland is required to be neutral in referendums. Does a civil society group have to, you know, if it wants to be a good one that's advocating for the rule of law and maybe values we want the rule of law to advance, be fair-minded in how it contributes to the debate and how it tries to help shape the public sphere into which it is trying to make its points? Because we're all in favor of, you know, fact-checking President Trump, but the reality is that, you know, I'm just using an obvious example, Hillary Clinton also made claims which the New York Times thought were less than wholly accurate in the US general election. So to a certain extent, I think in civil society groups, we tend towards increasingly wanting umpires, but we also want the umpires on our side. So I think it's just saying it's bad states are shrinking, the space for civil society is tricky, and I think we need to look at our own complicity in that as well.
Any thoughts about best practices there or guidance for civil society in negotiating those conflicts?
I think when you actually have functioning networks like Interaction or CIVICUS or other NGO platform in Ireland, the Wheel and DOCUS and so on, if you actually have a reasonably representative national NGO platform, it is by its very definition inclusive, and it by its very definition would be, shall we say, less biased one way or another. And it sort of, in my head at least, it reinforces the need for that sort of institution to exist. In the absence of that, it's this then, you know, who shouts loudest, who makes the best headlines, who's the most controversial, that then gets more mileage than the other. But I think it's really crucial to have those kinds of organizations, those kinds of networks, and to make them, if you will, responsible for convening that debate.
I mean, I'm just reflecting on the experience of NGOs in the UK Brexit referendum. I think most people concluded that many NGOs were self-censored and did not get involved in the debate, particularly where those who would have supported Remain, because they felt this chilling effect that NGOs should not be engaged in politics, which comes back to another fundamental challenge, which is around the very notion of the registered charity or the registered non-profit, you know, with a regulatory framework that prevents those actors from engaging in certain types of activities. I'm starting to wonder, as a personal reflection, whether that actually is part of the problem that we've created for ourselves. It's peculiarly strong in Anglo-Saxon countries where this model of a registered charity exists, because those organisations are not good at politics. And I think you're trying to make another point here, which is around the responsibility of all actors, which I agree with you. I mean, there's nothing as uncivil as civil society behaving badly. And we've got to urge maybe through the infrastructure bodies some codes of conduct. But I do worry on those sorts of moments of national political debates, certainly where there's the sort of registered charities or non-profits, they tend not to get involved institutionally, while of course as individuals people are highly active often.
There was the interesting case of GuideStar recently, or Charity Navigator, sorry, not GuideStar, in the US recently. So they decided to use the Southern Poverty Law Center list to flag on Charity Navigator groups that had been guilty of hate crimes. Mm-hmm. And of course there was a huge pushback from, in fact, particularly a number of Christian organizations objecting to this because they found themselves on this list. And Charity Navigator rolled it back. And so the hate list is still available, but you'd have to sort of specifically access it. It's not part of the general rating now. So that it's not easy is what I'm saying. When an anti-abortion group, for example, targets an abortion clinic violently, that would get them onto a hate list, which would then affect their overall credibility ranking on a Charity Navigator. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Mm-hmm. In my view, the more information I have, the better. So I'd like to be able to drill down and find out whether this organization had been involved in a hate crime. Some other people apparently think that's discriminatory. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a connection here between this challenge of maybe uncivil civil society and what you were describing as, I think, maybe kind of unmediated media that is maybe part of what is driving this particular challenge now globally is the internet and the fact that we're all media creators potentially, and that drives sensational commentary and things go viral, and I think that is part of the challenge that we're seeing in this space.
I do like, for example, the Wikipedia model, right, which says if a fact is posted on Wikipedia, first of all, there are checks and balances and editorial, if you will, filters, but more importantly, it's flagged as such. It says this doesn't have any substantiation. And I wish it was actually required of public media to be able to say, so-and-so claimed, we don't have any independent verification of this, or this happens to be an entity that is owned by the same people that own us. To make more visible the conflicts of interest, the lack of substantiation, and I'm not proposing that governments should regulate media. I am thinking that as consumers of media, we can start to demand more of that and start to push back on the norms for standards. Media.
Yeah, okay. Question back here.
Hi, I'm Stacey from Namati. So I have a bit of a curveball, maybe. It's something I've been pondering on quite a lot, is around the Tea Party movement in the United States and how it started as a protest movement. It was a civic movement, and they were able to organize within the political system. They were able to get $12 billion in funding and put forward candidates and overtake the political system. And is there something that we're missing with our liberally minded brains in this room that others are not? You're now seeing this being replicated across these kind of populist movements around the world, in Europe. And at the same time, you're now seeing the resistance movement in the United States looking to do similar tactics. But I think Indivisible has taken $1 million today, right? So you've got $1 million versus 12 billion. And there's also something in the fact that a lot of the kind of liberal protest movements are looking to fundamentally shift the entire system of capitalism, of governance, of these like major themes of how we are living as human beings. And there's something to me which is missing about like those two disparities. And is there something either that we can be learning from the right and what they've been doing? Because they are inclusive in a way, you know, they're bringing in huge numbers of people, they're supporting them up through the political process to be elected. They're working within the rule of law. You know, no one's doing it for the most part. So is there things that we should be learning better? Are there ways that we can counteract it? Or you know, and just something about the relationship of what is it that we in this educated, liberal, social good group maybe are overlooking. Some reflections on that.
So really, I think goes to the hearts and minds question that you all raised earlier or as part of the problem, right? That we've lost the middle class, or we've lost the hearts and minds, and how do we reclaim that constituency for civil society?
But also, I mean, just going back to say a George Lakoff kind of, you know, don't think of an elephant kind of premise, which is, you know, the left is just hopeless at framing. It's just hopeless at storytelling. It sort of assumes that if I put together a set of numbers and statistics, I will sort of by sheer force of my logic convince you to vote for me. And clearly that doesn't work. So, I mean, we do need to look at how we tell stories and how we frame issues. And certainly in my country, the RSS, which is the sort of social movement part of the right wing, gets more foreign funding than most NGOs do, and is supported by more Indians than any NGO is, because there's a cultural rootedness, if you will, that most organized secular NGOs completely lack. There's a lot to learn, basically. The short answer.
The question, and I think this conversation poses to me a challenge, which is I think we need to distinguish civil society from left.
Yes.
Don't we?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think what we really want to be talking about here is civil society without the political labels.
Yes.
Yeah. But perhaps a couple of points to what you said. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize also that there have been hugely successful rights-focused movements, right? So we shouldn't also forget that actually major progressive and social justice victories have been won over the past century or so through hugely successful grassroots movements. So it's not just a prerogative of sort of, you know, one particular part of the political spectrum, although I think what you're addressing is the current, more recent history. And I think one thing I have seen in the US, but perhaps also in Europe and maybe also in other parts of the world, that certain victories have been won at the political level or judicial level, and therefore there's sort of a feeling like we've won that fight and there's no longer sort of up for debate, when actually there's new movements that pop up that actually question these very same values that we've just sort of kind of thought that is now institutionalized. And you see this with sort of some of the right-wing populism in Europe, that they're putting in question things that I think had sort of, by other parts of the political spectrum, been depoliticized because they were seen as things that we've discussed and now they're law and now we're not challenging them anymore. And I think that's sometimes a problem, because then you can easily have challenger movements that then again put these very same things in question. But around the Tea Party, I mean, I think there's also something about organizing, you addressed this yourself, organizing around a very narrow set of issues around small government and taxes, and that had a huge amount of business support. And so there's something that's much easier to do than organizing for the very diffuse notion of civic space, or for a much more complex variety of issues that are under attack right now in countries like India. It's not as easy to frame it as this sort of one single cause that you're rallying around, because actually it's a much more diverse set of causes that don't necessarily have support of major business communities. So I think the challenge is a slightly different one, perhaps, as well.
And look, I mean, you wanted us to be optimistic, so let me be optimistic. That I think that history is on the side of people who are interested in, let's move beyond political labels, in rule of law, democracy, social justice. There have been important social movements in the last 3-4 decades around gender equality, or even more recently on LGBTI rights, that have won amazing and unimaginable, unexpected victories in some ways. But I think that the confusion, the sort of the paradigm shift that's going on, is in the nature of the way that citizens are organizing and mobilizing. And progressives, social justice, democracy, have tended to either put their faith in a political party, the Democrats or the Labour Party or whatever else it is, or in the NGOs to do their bidding, to protect those values. Whereas in fact, there's much more to civic life and civil society, and to boot, people are organising and mobilising in very different ways. They're raising resources and funding and raising profile in ways that were, we didn't even know about 10 years ago in terms of social media and the internet in terms. So I think that the navigation that we need to do is to sort of settle into these new forms. It may mean some really interesting things, like what will be left of the political party, the traditional political party of any sort in the coming few decades. Can we, or put more positively, can we build a new set of political institutions that responds to these new tools, to this new thirst that many people have for a much more engaged political life, a much more liquid, everyday democracy, not one that simply involves putting a vote into a ballot box every few years. And you could read all of the bad things we've spent the last hour and a half talking about, whether it's the rise of Modi or Duterte or the Brexit or Trump, as simply the growing pains in that move to the new landscape of Canada. But that then the positive onus for us then becomes, how can we create that next generation of political institutions?
As one activist put it recently, this is the darkness of the womb, not the darkness of the tomb.
Ah. Oh, I like that. Well, I've been told we have until 4:30 because of the rescheduling of the afternoon, so we'll bleed a little past our deadline here. Welcome to take more questions, and then we have our reception at 4:30. I promise I will keep to that.
I'm Chief of the Serbian Center for Investigative Journalism, and I want to continue on a positive note, despite everything. Serbia is not bad as some of the places you mentioned, but we're going into that path. Like, if you see that Hungary is following what Russia did, and Serbia is following what Hungary did, so we're going there. Sorry. We still didn't have a law to forbid NGOs and to make problems to them, but it has been mentioned in public space. We have a problem with trolls. Whatever you do online, you're gonna get attacked. And we are in a difficult position because we're kind of between an NGO and a media. The only way to keep our independence is basically being financed by donations from the government. So what we did at one point, we joined forces with a couple of other NGOs. I think you mentioned that, collaboration among us. So we're totally different by what we do, but we have a couple of same goals. Better judiciary, for instance, the protection of human rights of some groups, and so on and so on. And why is that important? Because all those areas are part of the chapters on Serbian EU accession process. And our government cares much more about that than just what we say. So there are 3 levels why that's important. First level is we still do our investigations. We published, I don't know, about wrongdoings of officials, about how public spending is not good, and so on and so on. But instead of just being that published as journalist stories, these other NGOs who are specialists in certain sectors, they take it over. Then they do advocacy, try to change laws, affect what government and ministries are doing. And the third level is we create reports about the state in those areas in Serbia, which are being sent to EU. And then there's another level of pressure, if I may say, to the Serbian officials. So, like EU says, you guys gotta fix this. You can't have so many problems with the judiciary if you want to join us. So that might be some kind of an idea, not great solution, but a bit of a solution for that joint forces between NGOs.
Great model. Okay. Other comments? 2 here. First in the front and then behind.
Good afternoon. I'm Özgür Öğret, Committee to Protect Journalists Turkey representative. Since you mentioned the human rights activists who were arrested in Turkey last week, I'd like to give you a little update on that. According to the ongoing state of emergency, the authorities had the right to keep them away from their lawyers for 1 week. Now this has been today extended to 2 weeks. So at this point we don't know their situation, how they are treated or anything. Also, our president has declared them military coup conspirators, that they were planning a continuation of the failed attempt of last year. And the pro-government media is putting government memos on headlines saying they were CIA agents, they were MI6 agents, etc. And my general question about this, it's a good example to my general question, because I believe civil society organizations are kind of a PR problem with reaching with the civil society, because when President Erdogan or somebody like President Putin or Trump starts name-calling traitors, terrorists, conspirators, whatever, in this day and age, they get lots of retweets, lots of posts, lots of support, etc. But when you try to answer with a statement of the president is misinformed because our work in that area, your voice is lost in the crowd. So, what do you think, do we have as civil society organizations, as a general, have a communication problem in that? And since we can't do the same thing as in name-calling and false accusations, how do you think we can get the public more interested in us?
I think you should talk to your friends in Belgrade for starts, but maybe their thoughts on the panel.
We do need to learn to do social media better. We certainly need to get over our disdain of it. And there's still too many civil society actors who think of Twitter as something that teenagers use to share pictures of their meals or something. It is where governance is happening. We need to treat the internet as the public sphere, where governance will happen, where citizenship will be exercised in this century. And we need to approach it as such, not as a medium for fundraising and for, garnering likes. We need to fundamentally reorient ourselves to the internet.
Yeah, I agree, communications is huge. Often I think it's a resource challenge, especially for smaller groups who don't have the great communications resources that a big company or organization would have. I think yesterday someone mentioned in our discussion a really interesting model of sort of pooling resources for a range of organizations and having a communications bureau for them that they could use to kind of aggregate their voices, but also just have access to resources they wouldn't individually have. So I think there's interesting models of how we could do better about just highlighting what is actually being done, because there's so many organizations working at the grassroots level that never have the chance to actually showcase what they're doing, their success stories, and how they're impacting people, because I think that's a crucial part of the story, is like, what are you actually doing and what impact do you have, and how do you showcase that more loudly, I think is really key.
And let's not forget, behind the comm strategy has to be some more work on building legitimacy of those actors themselves, because they can have a very fantastic comms strategy in response to the demonization, but it might actually backfire, because if they simply look like disconnected foreign-funded agents or whatever it is that they're being criticized of being. So it comes back to building constituencies. And I suppose unusual alliances as well. Again, this is a problem, I think, of the professionalized NGO sector. Not only is it in many cases disconnected from the communities that it claims to serve, but it's disconnected from faith groups, from sporting associations, from other bits of civil society, which are then rooted in communities. And we need to deploy all of those networks and alliances where it can help.
Ironically, some of the best use of technology is coming out of China, where the telecoms companies, people like Tencent and so on, have created these giving platforms, which are raising money for NGOs. That's not the important bit. The important bit is the innovation that's come into how NGOs are communicating with those donors. So now it's a one-click donation. You immediately get by text message and by multimedia message video from that NGO, reports from that NGO. Each of those reports is then accompanied by another ask. So there's some real innovation happening in some very unlikely places.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps to add, I think there's an interesting discussion happening around this in the US now as well, where lots of NGOs are feeling, oh, we missed the boat somehow and we're not reaching people that we want to reach, especially, for example, in the transparency and anti-corruption domain, where a lot of people feel like, how did we not capitalize on the resentment that there was that then led to people voting for Trump rather than actually an anti-corruption candidate? But how do we tap into this? And they're doing some really interesting research on framing and kind of like, how do we frame issues in ways that resonate with people? And it goes back to the constituency building as well. If you sort of are in Washington, DC and come up with elaborate strategies, but never actually check in with people on how they view the issue and how they view corruption in the US and what they see as the priorities, then there's this gap. And I think it's interesting to see that discussion now happening even within the US, which has a very strong civil society, and yet there's this perceived gap where somehow, oh, maybe we haven't listened closely enough to how people are actually perceiving and framing these issues. So I think there's more soul searching and research to be done there as well, and outreach.
Question here?
I'm Ross McLaren. I'm going back to some remarks that Danny made at the very beginning. I have possibly two related questions, many of the answers to which you might have already given, but what the heck. What you were saying, one of the first aspects of the trend was this coincidence of the closing space and the backsliding of democracy generally. And it made me think of one of my favorite lines from a favorite movie, High Fidelity. Was I miserable because I listened to pop music, or did I listen to pop music because I was miserable? Is the space closing because democracy is backsliding, or is democracy backsliding because the space is closing? Or in fact, are those just symptoms of a much, much, much deeper problem, which all of the symptoms of which we've spoken about in different ways? And is there something much more fundamental about either the fragility, the brittleness of political organization, of social organization, of economic organization that's causing all of these things, and that we're missing? And if we want to try to find solutions or at least make responses, of all of the ones that we've spoken about so far, are we just addressing the symptoms and not an underlying issue, whatever that underlying issue may be? And the second, hopefully related question is, when we think about fighting against the closing of civic space, are we thinking, are we implying, are we assuming of taking ourselves back to these last sort of 10 or 15 years, or 20 years of thinking that civic space is so wide and rich and vibrant, and we want to get back to that space? Or this darkness is the womb, not the tomb? Are we actually looking at something quite different? Are we looking at fighting against the closing of civic space with an end result that's much, much different from what we've had before? We don't know what that looks like. But I saw a lecture by Naomi Klein the other day, and she used this great term of it's a time now for reawakening our utopian imagination. Is that the space where we need to be now to think about what fighting against closing civic space looks like?
Great, thank you. Very provocative question. In fact, it's a much more eloquent version of the question that I was going to pose to wrap us up, and so maybe I will, which is, imagine for us civil society in 25 years, and we're well out of that womb, and we're a teenager or young adult. What does it look like? Ingrid, let me start with you.
Well, many more people under the age of 30 involved in civil society. I think part of it is a generational thing. I mean, we're sort of attached to a model that was our generation's model. Much more technology enabled, I suspect. And much more of this day-to-day active citizenship, sort of direct civil society, disintermediation, to use a polysyllabic word. So, much fewer intermediaries between beneficiary and donor, for example, or between government and citizen. I think those would be the big trends that I see, or the big norms that would come.
So moving beyond, to pick up here, moving beyond the treating of the symptoms to
reimagining it. Yeah. I mean, every conference I go to, there's that slide about how Uber and Airbnb and all the disruption that's happened in every industry. And then we go back and do the same thing we were doing, 10 years ago. We're still, carrying the same protest signs to the same marches, which can be ignored, have been ignored since, the beginning of the Iraq War. But we're still following that same model. I mean, 3 million people came out of the streets to protest that war. It didn't work, but we're still doing the same thing because it's what we are good at doing rather than what needs to be done. And business and everybody else has sort of moved on to other ways of doing things. Civil society, I think, is stuck in a bit of a time warp.
Saskia?
To your second point, are we trying to get back to something that we lost? I would say probably not. I think that would be probably the wrong approach to think about it, because there was never this utopia. I mean, certainly in some contexts it was better 10 years ago than it is now, that's for sure. But I don't think we can work backwards necessarily in that way. And I'd like to go back to something that you said earlier, which is, civic space is not something you can win and then have. It is a constantly contested space. And I think we need to think about it that way, that it is an ongoing struggle and it will always be there, whether that's in Germany or whether it's in India, or it's a constantly contestation of a power. But I think what I would wish for is sort of a more equal playing field in terms of who participates. And that also means sort of that it's not just a professionalized NGO sector, but that is something citizens feel ownership of and get involved in various ways and in more immediate and direct ways and with fewer barriers to participation for all people in the society. I think that's sort of what we're working towards. But I do think we need to think about it as a long-term struggle rather than something that is sort of taken care of once you get a good law in place, or but much more about sort of contestation of a power that is just continuous.
So I think to your first point around the democracy and closing space and causality, it is peculiar that we're at, the last 20, 25 years have seen unprecedented levels of democratization in many parts of the world. Obviously Central and Eastern Europe, but Sub-Saharan Africa, many parts of Asia. So in some ways, some of those victors of that democratic process trying to cling on to power and consolidate their power might be expected. But I still think that the underlying trends here are towards greater openness, greater participation. The online tools and social media and things like that are heading us towards more interesting ways of civic life manifesting itself. And it comes back, you can't put the participation genie back in the bottle. And many of the governments that are trying to do this, many of the internet regulations, are trying just to fight back. And you could also argue that Trump or Erdogan and others on social media are winning because we're still in that liminal period of trying to get used to the new norms, the new behaviors and the new cultures of how we all behave in this new era when everyone's a media producer, consumer, and everything in between. So I think, I'm pretty confident that the rest of the 21st century will once again see greater forms or newer forms of democratic participation or civic participation. Things might get worse for the next few years, but they'll have to get better. And that's what I think, that's the long game for all of us interested in this. It's much like, I think, the long game for those of us interested in rule of law has been to build a set of institutions, norms and practices that has put into place this belief and practice of rule of law. I think that's if you move on to what we've been discussing about, it is what are the institutions, norms and practices around civic participation in the 21st century. Those formations are going to look very different in 25 years. I even wonder whether the sort of registered charity 501c3 type model will even stand the test of time. The sorts of things that, the sort of institutions that Mott Foundation, that CIVICUS have protected, their days may be numbered. But that's the price that we pay, I think, for that next generation of civic formations that are going to emerge.
There's a model that I think we need to pay more attention to, and that's the internet governance model. they've, for now, a decade or more, had a multi-stakeholder model rather than a multilateral model. Civil society has more space and more voice in the internet governance space than it has, even in the climate space or anything else. It's tedious, it's painful, their processes. Every tiny objection has to be resolved by multiple committees and multiple layers of decision making. But it's much, much more reflective of the sort of governance we need, which is, it's not governments versus civil society versus business, it's governments, businesses, and civil society working collectively to arrive at policies that then shape the global internet as we know it, and all parts of it, the hardware part of it, the regulatory part of it, the naming and that part of it, all of it. So it's an extremely cumbersome beast that they've created, multiple fora, many different actors, but it may be the thing that we're evolving towards. Or it may have some clues about the direction in which we need to evolve.
Okay. Well, much more reimagining and discussion to be had. But thank you all for coming, for your work on this topic, your work in civil society, and certainly to our panel for this discussion.